I was very pleased to be asked because I've always wanted to have a think about what living in other cultures means. I've done quite a lot of it myself and had to learn only modern European languages, but it's had a profound effect on me and the way I think about the nature of philosophy, knowledge, and so on. And this gives me an opportunity to think through, so I really didn't look at too many references until the end. I think I looked at Nick's paper and Martha's paper at the very end of writing my own paper, just to try and think through some issues that have been very personally important for me. So, to start with a personal experience, I was cooking steak and potatoes once in Paris during theology studies there. And I had what for me was a very, very profound experience. First of all, being an Englishman, cooking in Paris is not neutral. There's an enormous hermeneutical background that you're swimming in and drowning in. During this episode of cooking the steak and potatoes, it got to about 25 minutes into the process, and I jumped up. It was my turn to cook on a Saturday. We had a wonderful cook for the whole week, but we all took a turn on a Saturday. And I jumped up, as I always do, and stuck my knife in the potato. And a French friend of mine said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm testing the potatoes." He said, "Potatoes take 30 minutes to cook. Why are you testing this one potato?" I said, "Well, you always do that because there are big potatoes, there are little potatoes, there are medium potatoes, there are different types of potatoes." He said, "No, potatoes take 30 minutes to cook." And anyway, we went on and on for hours and hours, and we ate the meal. But the thing that hit me at that point was the question of this, what we talk about it in philosophy as the background, or the hermeneutical presuppositions which we swim in, became meat and potatoes for me at that point. Literally meat and potatoes, where they can seem incredibly theoretical and distant from the actual lived experience. They became very concrete at that time. And the difficulty, I think, sometimes of questions of translation is the meat and potato example. That's the challenge. The basic presuppositions of what we mean by meaning, how those meanings are in complicated webs of relations, is made thematic in those sort of abrupt clash moments of my example, the meat and potato example. So what I wanted to do in my paper was to try and have a look at what I call the anthropological attitude of translation in order to translate. And here I'm not talking about the dog sat on the mat type of examples, which often in philosophy, they become the units to think through. And you can come through with quite simple epistemological answers when you take those types of word relations. But when I think you deal with, and you know much more than me, very complicated literary texts and their worlds, such as the Bible, I think you're thrown into an enormously complex set of meat and potato situations, or that anthropological attitude that makes for translation particularly complex and difficult. So in order to get a handle on that, I wanted to try and think through really one question in the paper. What does it mean to be fluent in a language? It seems to me slightly transversal, I think, to the topic of the conference of translation, but I hope it has some significance for what the nature of translation is. What does it mean for a translator to be fluent? And what constitutes a translator? And so, what does that tell us about the nature of translation? So first of all, a definition. I don't think it's very controversial. Translation is the communication of meaning from the source to the target language. The problem, I think, is what do we mean by meaning? And what do we mean by the nature of language? I think these are the issues which really need some a lot of conversation between us to get a sense of how perhaps different shades of that have different implications for the various theories we subscribe to or not. So in the paper, I talk about moving from individual word learning, and I use my own experience of being an adult learner of foreign European languages. So in that case, moving from individual words to sentences to context and so on, as my own experience of what becoming fluent in a foreign language means. So I talk about questions of how recognition happens between one word in the original native language and the newly acquired language, how that happens, how you check for consistency in that process of becoming fluent, and how that process is not isolated from a particular context where particular words are freighted with meaning. I think the meaning in English of duty and the meaning in German of duty are very, very different. I can only say that having lived in Germany for a number of years, 5 years in my own case. But the impact of Pflicht, ruft, duty calls in German and English, that's what I'm interested to make explicit. That transition from saying duty calls in English to duty calls in German. What is the difference that makes that a particular interest for a translator? I think it's incredibly hard to get a grip on that, because when you take the simple, the lexical transference of the meaning of the words, you don't raise the question. When you take the anthropological context within languages always enmeshed as the question, then you necessarily have to ask that question. So there's quite a bit on that in the paper. Also, Martha raised a very good point. I tried to draw a distinction between meaning and understanding in the paper, based on the question of validity, the notion that you can understand a grammatically well-formed sentence, such as, this automobile is yellow, but it's false. It doesn't reference that object to which it is speaking. And I think we ordinarily understand that. Saying that, for me, means there is an understanding to that sentence, or the propositional content is understandable, but I think it's not full of meaning. It doesn't have meaning. It's invalid. Its reference is not correct. So in that sense, in the paper, the difference between meaning and understanding is due to the nature of validity. And with objects in the world, that validity is the correspondence to the propositional content uttered. Because I think we understand things that have no meaning. And that's what I wanted to allow space for. I think we understand a lot of things that are meaningless. And in a simple example, I think that for me is one example of how we can understand something that does not have a meaning. Its meaning is based on its validity, which is, in this case, incorrect. This elephant is yellow is meaningless, even though we understand the propositional content. I think that's important because I think a lot of the time we understand each other quite well about meaningless things. So the question of meaning then opens the question of the different layers of meaning in various linguistic forms. And I chose one specific example because I think it raises the anthropological question quite apparently, quite strongly really, the question of joking and humour. They say you should never make jokes in foreign languages, and I'm sure from personal experience many of us can agree with that. Sometimes the falling flat of a joke in another context is due to this hermeneutical swamp, shall we call it, which does not transmit between one linguistic context and another linguistic context. So I took the example of I think it was in the 1960s, the film by Eric Sykes called Rhubarb. And if I was more technologically sophisticated, I would have had a clip at this point. Anyway, I'm not. But basically the storyline is it's a golf match between a vicar and a policeman. And there are only 2 words uttered in the whole 30-minute film, rhubarb. 30 minutes of uttering one single word in a film, which is also a script, by the way. You can buy the script. So you can do exegesis on the script. How would you translate rhubarb? That's the sort of question I'm interested in, because I think it's an extreme example of this anthropological issue, which is at the heart, it seems to me, of complex literary translation. How do you translate that type of thing which transcends the lexical equivalence? So I think a lot of philosophy goes wrong because it reduces language to lexical equivalence. You know, the dog sat on the mat type of example. And I think it seems to me in your areas, biblical studies and so on, they are not sufficient to raise the complexity of the issues involved in the nature of translation. Now, dinner for one, if you are of a German background, would be another example. In fact, the Germans every New Year fall off their chairs laughing about this play on the English. It's an old lady who's drunk and the butler and so on. This is a religious duty for Germans to watch every New Year, dinner for one. And the English sit looking at this and think, what's so funny? I remember the first time I thought, why are you laughing about this? That's the issue of translation, I think, in complex literary texts. You can translate literally the words. If you do not make a stab at this anthropological context in which meaning is constituted, then you're not, it seems to me, a literary translator or translating literary text with the skill required. I think that raises the question of insider-outsider perspective. This sort of zooms around many different domains. Take the example of the study of religion. You know, the 19th century traditions of the study of religion were very much sort of pre-colonial model, as Nick was talking about. You know, the scientist comes along, tells religion what's really going on. If only you could understand and see what's happening. It's really to do with social solidarity, or religion's to do with meaning and so on. The explanation in another language is, in a way, that pre-colonial legacy in studies of religion, various university departments. That we now talk about insider-outsider perspective means we're complexifying those issues. Where you are in relationship to the discourse. I had a wonderful example this morning about Nick's question of God lies beneath the surface of the text. If you're an insider to that language, that's a very important question. If you're an outsider, you know, it's of interest, but it has no impact. These are inescapable hermeneutical questions today. We are no longer, I think, naive about the simplicity of texts and the notion that a text could even in principle be context-less or presupposition-less. I think that complexifying of the questions makes things very, very interesting. So it's what in philosophical jargon is called in the phenomenological tradition, one way of doing philosophy, the background, the Lebenswelt, the life world. The taken for granted stock of knowledge that allows us to be together with having to negotiate everything. I usually use the example in class of, in a lecture, when you go into a lecture, you don't need to tell the students not to stand on the tables. Well, in certain colleges you do, but certainly not at Heythrop. That background stock is an already taken for granted set of rules and norms and a whole collective of ways of seeing the world that we have been socialized into. Making those sorts of things explicit seems to me also part of the struggle for translators. When your contexts are geographically different, but I guess for Bible translators, temporally very, very different. So the importance of spatio-temporal difference, I think, is very important, because the background is different in different contexts. The meat and potato example is my very trite example of that, but there's an infinite. I'm sure you have your own examples of that, that raise the issues. So really what I'm trying to do in my paper is look at the anthropological dimension of language. For example, the question I teach one module here called Modern French Thought. So I think in the 5 committees it had to go through, people weren't sure, do the French do philosophy? Remember John Paul II was asked about the English. He said, do the English do philosophy? These are real issues, I think, that affect the way meaning is transmitted. And the fact that, in my experience of teaching this, the overly convoluted nature which buys into the sort of the English notion of the French are all complicated and it works because often the translations, they just get lost. What does it mean, the fact that they get lost? That it just does not work. It's like saying, how do you translate Mozart into Beethoven? Although you can do it into rap. I thought, yes, you could do Mozart in rap. So everything's slippery in this, but I think it's the slippery I'm interested in, because I think that's where translators find the greatest challenge. What is the problem with the French and the English? It's something about the music. It's something about the way you say it. I remember I did theology in Paris, and they always talk about le déjà là, le pas encore. The already and the not yet, sort of the eschatological thing. I said it in English, I thought, you just don't, it just doesn't work, does it? That's what I'm interested in the paper. Why doesn't it work and what's lost? And why does it work? The choice between does it or doesn't it work for me is a false choice. It does both things at the same time. And that's the challenge of thinking through the nature of translation. So it seems to me what a translator requires, as well as the lexical stuff, knowing your grammar and all that sort of stuff, is this anthropological eye. I think that's the case because I think what the nature of languages are symbol systems. And symbol systems need to be interpreted. They're not, in these sorts of contexts, they're not talking dog sat on the mat, they're not self-evident. They are by their nature interpretive units. And there's no escape, I think, from the challenge of having to say, as Nick was talking this morning, this is the way I do it. What do you think? Well, 10 will say good, 10 will say not so good. I think the inescapable nature of that needs to be thought through. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's the nature of translation. I think that's due to old notions of knowledge we've inherited from epistemological traditions of Plato and so on. But then I go into the jargon, so I'll come out quite quickly. So the questions of insider-outsider, I think, are very important. To do with the nature of the inescapable nature of your location with respect to the text and what the text speaks about, and how texts are always politicized, always from a certain angle. Meaning, it seems, is never residue-free of those hermeneutical shades. And how you translate that, I think, is inescapable in terms of your own choices of fidelity and creativity and so on. I take one very simple, my examples are, I did live with people doing PhDs in the Bible, and they would always say, oh, yes, we're on our 15th language now, as they said Akkadian to me, and I sort of melted into the floor, so I could only do this to people who do biblical scholarship, because I know how much effort it takes. So I take a very simple one from my own experience of what it means to pull somebody's leg. And the notion in Spanish, you don't pull someone's leg, you take their hair. I think the literalist models do the lexical transference thing. So, you know, if you're reading the sort of the text, you would translate it very much as taking somebody's hair. But if meaning is constituted also in reception, not only in production, then you're not transferring the meaning. In other words, where is meaning constituted in a text? I think it's transmitted and constituted both in origin and reception. And in between that process is the complex ontological constitution of meaning. There's no context-free transmission of meaning. And there's no meaning to be grasped essentialist-like outside of some constitution through a receiver of that. So in the paper I use two examples, one to illustrate the temporal issue, the SCOTUS example, and one to use the issue of the spatial difference, the traffic light example of that unfortunate professor, historical professor, who was brutally arrested in America for jaywalking when he thought, using the English hermeneutical background, of there's no cars, it's silly to wait, isn't it? The SWAT team comes, pushes him down, pushes him down, what are you talking? He'd already been living 2 years in the States. He didn't get that hermeneutical background. And that was after 2 years. I think that for me is not surprising, because what meaning is emerges out of that context. Traffic signals being signs like words. So they were some of the issues of the text. I also wanted to raise a question of language and perception. This is a whole show, so I won't go on about this one, but I don't know whether anyone can recognize, can anyone recognize that?
Yes. It's one of these organisms thing.
It's an organism?
Yeah, what's the word for it? I know the Dutch word for it, but sorry, I don't know.
It's an organelle.
Yeah.
Yes, in other words, in every cell, the animal cell, you have factories that produce energy. That's the factory that produces energy in our animal cells, called a mitochondrion. Mitochondria in the plural. Now, knowing that tells me enormous amount about that, probably equivalent to one of the St. Paul's letters that you could spend 3 years doing a PhD on. That, knowing that language makes me perceive that in a way, I think, which is different significantly from those who don't know the language. So language actually shapes, I think, our perception by meaning, making the various strange patterns here into universes of meaning that become accessible when you know the language. This is a standard electron microscope image that you get every day and people pore over. So I think the issue of language and perception is a fascinating one. And I think, to a significant degree, language does shape perception and allows us to perceive things that we don't without the linguistic meaning that happens when we know particular languages. I'm not sure if that has any relevance to the biblical area, but that's the conversation we're having now. But it struck me that day in, day out, medical specialists are reading these, I call these texts. This is an image that people are reading day in, day out to make meaningful decisions and actions about people's lives, operations, and so on. So I think, for me, the centre of textual studies, from a philosophical point, I want to broaden it out. Say, if we had a conference on medical imagery, then that would be a fascinating conference, how people read these X-ray diagrams or electron microscope images and so on. Because often you pick up ideas in one domain, you can apply them in your completely different area. I think that's a very fascinating opportunity at conference. We can do that. Anyway, enough about that. So, some conclusions. So essentially in the paper what I've argued is translation employs the skills which lead to fluency, so the whole recognition set, but also this anthropological set that I wanted to make thematic in my paper. A second conclusion is that in complex literary texts, there's an inescapable interpretive dimension. And that means there's never an exact fit between source and target. Does that mean you can't translate? Not at all. It means that's the nature of translation, and the art of it is that. And the third conclusion is essentially trying to get this tension, I think, really, between two what can be constructed as opposing things. I don't think they are. I think they define what we mean by knowledge today, what we mean by truth today. That they're not simply relativism or objectivism. Both, I think, have noble long traditions behind them, but they no longer help us today. We need something more complex between those two straw men, I think. At the moment, they're straw men, neither relativism nor objectivism models of transmission of meaning. So that's the way I tried to phrase it. Languages, like cultures, are sufficiently similar to allow for translation and sufficiently different to make such translation interesting. In other words, it's both similarity and difference. It's neither one nor simply the other. The final point I had was I'm not sure every language can do everything. There are apparently 7,000 languages, are there? I don't know whether these 7,000 languages all do exactly the same things. I don't know whether we have empirical data on that. Can you talk about that electron microscope image in Akkadian? What would it mean? Because they always told me, oh, that's the really hard one for the biblical people, the Akkadian, so I thought I'd wheel out the big one. Can you talk about electron microscope image in Akkadian? I don't know Akkadian. But I think there's some of the deeper issues that once we move beyond the simple languages that I know to the languages that people like you know, that it's interesting to reflect upon, because they might then be test cases for other types of genre, liturgy and so on, or whatever within ancient texts that are equally interesting to think about. So anyway, that was a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
First of all, I like the way you've, well, many of us end up with words like language is possible, impossible, difficult, tortuous. You've chosen interesting, and I like that. At times you've used the phrase communicate meaning or transfer meaning. You've used both ways. At other times you've used the phrase meaning is constituted here and then here.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, is there a tension between those two metaphors? Is it meaning that is transferred from here to here, in which case meaning is somehow objectively independent? at least in my mind when I hear that phrase. Or if meaning is constituted here and then here, and something happens in between, is meaning being transferred? Or is something else being transferred? Is it like, if I, maybe I've got a transistor radio here, and I can play Roll Over Beethoven, and then I unplug it, and I pick it up, and I take it over here, and I can play Roll Over Beethoven there too. Have I transferred the music? I don't know, I'm mixing metaphors a lot, but I'm wondering, did you mix a metaphor, or am I just a bit fuzzy about it?
I mean, I don't think objectivism and subjectivism are either or choices. I think both have aspects that need to be thought through. So, in terms of mixing, I think it seems to me that I think we probably all agree translation is possible, means something must be transmitted that we call meaning. Otherwise, why would we agree to the fact we can translate? It seemed to me all the papers made that presupposition, or at least agreement. So there is some sort of sense of meaning that's has an origin, shall we say. But the reception of that meaning, I think, is not simply passive for the, and I'll use a bit of jargon, for the ontological constitution of meaning. The active reception of meaning is itself constitutive of the meaning of a text. The degree to which it is constitutive is exactly, I think, this tension between faithful translation and creative translation, and the decisions translators make are judged according to that balance between the two. Or at least, I'm not a translator, I'm talking really out of hand there, other than my own experience of living in other languages and having to think this through. And I was a simultaneous translator a number of times and made a complete mess of it at a very prestigious conference at the Sorbonne once. And it was incredibly painful. I thought, gosh, because of the, you know, the way the Germans put often the things at the end and that, and I went in too quickly and so on, and we got completely lost. But I think these are the issues, aren't they, to try and think through. And I think it's not a question of if there's an origin, there's no dynamic constitution of meaning, there's both. So in that way, I think both aspects need to be thought through to avoid, on the one hand, literalism, and on the one hand, the Our Father example that Nick gave. This is completely detached from what we would consider a meaningful translation. Do you want to feel?
Well, I think we'd better choose Marta before she pops.
That's right. I agree with your main thrust of your argument. However, I do have a couple of issues. I'll limit myself to two.
Yeah, you have supervisory meetings with him.
Yes. I'm meeting you more often, but so we'll come back to this. Yes. Well, your distinction between understanding and meaning, and your example. If that example is illustrative of what you mean, then I'm not buying it. If I say this automobile is yellow, I agree with you that is meaningless, although it is a grammatical sentence. We can distinguish the propositional content of the sentence that automobile is yellow. We can tell what has to be true in the world for that sentence to be true. So that is a sentence that has it's not complete gibberish. There's what you call understanding. You can understand the sentence. Right, so far, so good. And it is meaningless because it completely doesn't fit in the context. This isn't an automobile. However, if I say this USB stick is red, that is a sentence that you can not only understand, but it's also meaningful in this context. Because it is a USB stick indeed. And we can all tell that this is a USB stick. However, although it is a meaningful sentence, because it does fit in the context, it is false. So I think sentences do not derive their meaning from their truth or falsity. I think that is very counterintuitive. And there is a distinction, of course, to be made between purely a propositional content or the representational content of a sentence, and I completely agree with you that there is a tradition in Anglo-American philosophy that focuses too much on that content and that it doesn't cover its meaning, because the meaning of a sentence has to do with how it sits in a context with actual people in the actual world and how people engage with the sentence. Yeah. Which I think is a different thing than effect, but we can talk about that later. And so I'm unclear about your distinction between understanding and meaning. I do understand, like, there's understanding in the sense that we recognize something as a grammatical sentence and we recognize its propositional content, and that meaning has to fit in a context in some form. We have to be able to reflect on it and tell whether it's true or false. But I don't know if its validity is dependent on it being true. I think that's counterintuitive. And also, if meaning is constituted by the effects that a language episode, say a text or a sentence or an utterance or a speech, if that is constituted by effect, then no sentence or utterance or text can really have a meaning, because its effect is different for each reader. Each and every reader receives a text differently. So then meaning, of course its effect is different in all cases, but its meaning would then be very different in various cases. And I think intuitively you want to be able to say something insightful about what a text is, not outside of its context, but independently of whomever happens to read it. I think that's quite contingent, whoever happens to take the text off the shelf. I think that's quite contingent. I think you want to be able to say something significant. A translator ought to be able to say something significant about a text, independent of who happens to read it. I said, rather the addressee, therefore, would have a higher analytical status than the effect that it actually has on the world, because you can't predict that. Those are two.
I mean, I think meaning is not totally constituted by its effects. Meaning is not completely unaffected by its effects. Meaning is partially constituted through its effects. So that's the difference. I think it's not 0 or 100 on that. So that would be, I think, that is crucial.
I think it's nearly independent.
Yes, I think that's a difference. I don't think it is. And that we all read a text with slightly different meanings, I take almost to be self-evident.
Yes.
And not destructive of translation. But the reality that no one sort of holds the meaning anywhere in one place is the nature of hermeneutics. This is not an epistemological, to use a jargon, notion of translation. This is a hermeneutical model. And I think that's the difference. That sort of makes epistemologists very scary, because of the theory of knowledge that is undermined by that is that tradition, a certain tradition of epistemology. So in that way, I don't have a problem with that. But on the other extreme, shall we say, I don't think that the reception of the meaning is the only thing that constitutes meaning either. In other words, they are the sort of the relativist, they call it the lunatic fringe, shall we say. And there are the sort of the absolutist fringe as well. I'm in favour of neither, because I don't think it happens that way. The fascist call, yes. And then the first one, in terms of meaning of validity, I mean, I do think it's quite, when you say to a child, this cup is yellow, the child will scream, no, it's not, it's black. I think that truth function is sufficient to draw the distinction between meaning and understanding for me. And that's a difference. And I think children pick that up.
I think it's just false. It's not meaningless. It's false.
Well, I think meaning is tied to validity. What I think you're doing is understanding. I understand that proposition, but that does not have a meaning.
It might be metaphorical. It might have
In,
meaning.
yes.
You're taking a literalist reading of it, but it
Yeah.
could have meaning. And in linguistics, they distinguish between grammatically true and pragmatically true.
Yes.
So that is grammatically meaningful.
Yes.
It's pragmatically not meaningful. But in certain contexts, it could be meaningful.
But falsities are very
Right.
meaningful in very many contexts. That's the point.
Although yes,
Used for fictions,
yes,
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting that you mentioned the child, because I was just thinking during the lecture, I consider 10-year-old children to be language users, and they say this elephant is yellow all the time because they're playing, and playing is a real activity and we consider it valid. Now we tend not to do it when we grow up, although there are conventions.
We do it a lot.
We do. There's a lot, actually. But I wonder what happens when children, they have a cardboard box and suddenly it's an aeroplane and it's blue and they're flying. And we consider it valid, this activity, although truth claims are being made which are...
Was Sherlock Holmes a detective?
Can I
Is that a
refer-
meaningful sentence, yes or no?
That
It's
to
not
me
true.
Is meaningful.
But it's not true. Because Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, it doesn't exist.
Is it just a question of the universe of inquiry?
Yes. I think so.
The universe of becoming God is true.
It's true.
Yeah.
In other words, there isn't one world. There's the world of objects.
Is this USB stick red? This USB stick is red. Is that a meaningless sentence?
I think it is, because it's in there.
I think that's counterintuitive.
Yes. So, I mean, I think that is a difference.
So we have a lunch.
Or we
dinner.
can go that route. It's meaning in one register.
Yeah.
And there are many different registers of
Yeah,
meaning.
maybe, but that is meaningful then. I think fiction is meaningful, and I think meaningful in particular registers might
Is there
still
a meaning?
meaningful.
But the reason I wanted to draw this distinction was because I think we need to say there are meaningless sentences.
Yes, I think so
And
too.
there are meaningless phrases.
Yes.
Not everything is meaningful.
I think so too, but I think that distinction does not
Yeah.
rest on its truth or falsity.
And I think it has to. Because of the internal relationship to validity of meaning.
Yeah, but I don't think validity is
Yeah.
truth or falsity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of philosophy language
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah.
It might have relevance. Yeah.
So does that imply that every time you think someone's wrong, that what they're saying is meaningless? So
Wrong?
If you, for example,
Yes.
have a discussion with another philosopher about what Kant was really on about
Yes.
in a particular bit of text, Kant, and they say something that you think is wrong, does that mean that what they said is meaningless? Because that seems to be the implication of what they
It could do if you say, but there are, you're not saying what they're saying is not to do with understanding. It's not a meaningful. If somebody has something wrong, then I suppose I'm trying the line to say that what constitutes wrongness then? That for me is the question.
It's truth or falsity.
Yes. And that for me is the validity connection.
Yeah, but not it's meaningless, I think.
What happens when you
think
cannot
that-
falsify or verify? You just cannot. And then, is there no point in the utterance? Is it as though it were not said?
But-
It still has an effect.
But aren't we then back in?
would know.
Yeah.
But aren't we then back into? Doesn't this coincide with the insider outsider
Yes.
ideal? And because this is red, could be true if I've taught you that black is red, right?
Yes.
If inside of my group we reference this colour as red, because as you were talking about, red as a content word in itself is meaningful because of the agreement we have on what red is, and to somebody who's colourblind
Yes.
may look very, very different inside their head, even though they've learned to see that that's red. I'm interested in the insider-outsider thing because, again, in biblical studies, of course, for those inside, this is a text that quite often does definitely have a meaning we're trying to find out. That's why we're doing. I mean, somebody said to me at British New Testament Studies this week, yes, but if your questions don't tell us what this text means, what it really meant in its original context, what's the point of asking them?
Yeah.
So the idea that there's definitely something under there that if we search enough we'll get to
Yes.
is really important. When kind of, to us, in my particular seminar group, we weren't that fussed about whether there was a meaning, because we were interested in bigger, kind of different questions. Augustine, do you think you agree with Augustine? But Augustine liked the idea that there were many translations exactly because he thought there was an extra textual kind of floating meaning. He says that the meaning of Scripture is strictly autonomous from the temporal verbal signs by which it is expressed, and for this reason Scripture may be translated from one historic language to another. And he's really positive about the idea that there's lots of different ones, different translations that give you different, because there is something solid. Which is quite nice, because it means that he can think that and have lots, and then people can think that there isn't any meaning and have lots to express that as well, and you still have, you've got the same methods.
Many horses and the perfect form of a horse.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it. He seems to, but it's interesting that the belief. I think we often think that believing that there is one definite meaning means we should be heading towards one perfect translation, and actually, Augustine seems to give that as a reason why there are lots, because there is something outside.
Can I just ask a question about jokes?
Yeah.
I was really interested in what you said about jokes, and I think I did use it to translate. But when you're translating ancient texts over a couple of millennia, it's even whether you recognise whether it's a joke translation. Yes. Some of the dreary books I've ever read, things like humour in the Old Testament. But, you know, if you think about the way Hebrew works grammatically and syntactically in terms of the biological roots and things, you've got a whole punning element available in it that doesn't really translate very well, let alone your anthropological swap.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you can say about that element of translation when you don't really know what the meaning was in the first place.
I mean, for me, I was trying to think, what would it be like a school for translators? What would I have on the curriculum? People went to do an undergraduate degree in translation studies. What would I put on the curriculum? Well, first of all, what sort of texts are these people interested in? Then I would see what type of time travel. And by that, I don't mean as a joke. I mean, historically, I think history is time travel. What sort of history is required for the curriculum? What sort of geographical experience is required, as you do in archaeological studies and so on. Get a sense of that. Is that completely complete? No. Without it, I think the translator is much the poorer. So how do you do that in text? I mean, I don't know in terms of Hebrew text, but it strikes me that's the work of the translator, to do the necessary and possible time travel to get as much as they can into that context. Anthropologically, I'd say, that for me is really important in the University of Translation Studies, rather than the notion that, oh, it doesn't matter, I can get the exact meaning without doing that. I think that's what I was trying to get at. If I had a bogeyman, it would be literalism in this text.
I think you're absolutely right. I think translating humour is incredibly difficult. And having worked with lots of different translation teams for many, many years, there are two sides to the problem. The first problem is whether or not we recognise the humour that's present in the original. And the second one is, having expressed it as you have thought for your receptors, will they recognise it in what you've done? Because they may not necessarily. There are huge numbers of people who read the NEB account of Elijah on Mount Carmel, taunting the prophets of Baal, who don't recognise that shout loud perhaps he's engaged is the most glorious pun on taking a dump. But it's there, but you have to know it. But how else can you translate it without making the point so that it doesn't work? It's horribly hard.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I would be interested to do this in philosophy, you know, because we don't have a lot of anthropological attitude often in philosophy, and I think that's why we lose out a great deal in complexity and satisfaction for philosophical questions of translation.